It's the Bird Emergency, the show where we talk about birds, bird people, bird nerds, the threats to birds, and what people, the extraordinary people who are trying to preserve them, are doing all over the world. And it's my pleasure for this episode to speak to Mr. Yoav Perlman, and he's talking to me today from Israel. So that's not very Australian. So welcome, Yoav. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
It's my pleasure. I I found you by just looking around for people who were working in places that were pretty foreign to Australia, that were very different to Australia. Because I'm sure regular listeners will know that most of the voices we've been hearing have been Australians or people who have been working in Australia. But Yoav's working in Israel, but has also been a tour guide for many places around the world. But what I really wanted to ask about was start with some of the work that Yoav had done with bustards. I thought that was pretty fantastic. They're an amazing looking bird, threatened. Just, I think every species of bustard is now threatened. So, Yoav, what got you working with bustards?
Yeah, so between 2014 and 2018, I joined a PhD program at the University of East Anglia in Norwich in the UK. So I relocated there with my family for 4 years. Um, so my office was in the UK in the university, but my research subject and my fieldwork was carried out in Spain and Portugal, and I was working on great bustards. Great bustards are great birds indeed, the heaviest flying birds in Europe. They also have extraordinary sexual dimorphism, so the males are really huge bulls and the females are much, much smaller. And they're fascinating birds. They are going through quite a serious decline across their range, especially in Iberia, where most of the population is still found, most of the world population. They are losing grounds there because of more and more intensive agriculture over the last few decades, especially with the European Union subsidies and other large scale processes. The traditional agriculture is losing ground to more intensive industrial agriculture. And the great bustards, as many other birds and other animals that over millennia adapted to this low intensity traditional farming system, they're not coping well with these new systems. Breeding productivity is very low and the numbers are dropping. So in my research, I worked together with the government of Extremadura and the government of Alentejo, two regional governments in Spain and Portugal, and together with BirdLife International. And we tried to link land use changes to how these bustards are faring. The results were quite sobering, but hopefully included some important conservation recommendations that will improve the situation of busters and other agro steppe species in Iberia. So it was an exciting time to spend in Iberia, a lot of field work, a lot of analysis, and sitting down on my bum, as many ecologists do. But it came out as a nice PhD, I think. It was good to be there. But in 2018, I returned to Israel and back to my former position in Birdlife Israel.
Before we talk about Birdlife Israel, what do you think it has been the effect of the work you did on the bustard? Do you know if there's been any changes in the way farming is done in the areas where they're still hanging on, and is the population still declining?
It's a very complex situation. I'll be honest with you. The situation is a bit different in Portugal and in Spain. I think in Portugal, the conservation NGOs are a bit more proactive, and they manage to protect the areas where the bustards and other steppe birds are concentrated better. In Spain, the challenges are quite serious, especially in Extremadura and southwest Spain. Yeah, things are not looking very good, I must say. But yeah, these processes take time. I think that the knowledge base is there, the science is there, and conservation based on evidence, based on science, I think has a better potential. So hopefully in a few years, we will see a change in trends, but currently the situation is not easy there.
No, that conflict between agriculture and other land use and intensive land use is and nature is always there, and I think in those rural areas of the Iberian Peninsula, the the pressures just to survive on the villages is far more intense than people who are living in urban situations working normal jobs. I don't know. That's if we could solve that conflict, the world would be in a better shape all round, wouldn't it?
That's right. First of all, this kind of conflict, it's everywhere around the world in different flavors and different colors, but it's basically the same story everywhere. In Australia, I'm sure there are similar cases as well. I think that in the case of Europe, the European Union can be a very powerful and useful tool to promote pan-European conservation agenda or conservation policies. Birdlife Europe are working very hard in this arena to try and use the European Union tools to make achievements across the continent. So the opportunities are quite great. The risks are great as well. I think that compared to other parts of the world, at least in Europe, there is place to listen. There is place to talk in the policy level. The policymakers, the politicians, the leaders are there. They're talking about it. They're thinking about it. Of course, the global processes are very powerful, and conservation is not always in the top of the agenda of everyone, obviously. But I think that there are opportunities in Europe with the European Union to make some serious achievements, and hopefully things will happen there in the next decade or two. Hopefully it's not too late for some species like the great bustard, but I think that at least the directions are promising.
Now, you mentioned that the Iberian Peninsula, which is made up of Spain and Portugal, is the stronghold for the great bustard. Let's talk about their range. Where else are they found in any sort of significant number? And do you have a population estimate for their global population?
Yeah. So historically, the range extended across the grassland belt in Europe and Asia. Even in the UK, there is quite a successful reintroduction program in recent decades in the UK and the south of the UK. But currently, we're talking about the extent range from Iberia and the southwest across Central Europe, places like Austria and Germany, Hungary, and into Ukraine, Russia, and across Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia to China. So it's a huge global range. There's quite serious variation in the behavior of the migratory behavior of the bustards across the range. So the bustards of Iberia are mainly resident or almost resident. They do some post-breeding movements, maybe 100, 200 kilometers from here to there, but nothing significant. While the far eastern great bustards of China are long-distance migrants. They migrate thousands of kilometers, so they do proper migration. Yeah, so they're globally vulnerable. They're threatened across the range, especially in the east of the range. The estimates are not very accurate. In Iberia, it's something like 30,000 adult individuals. That's the estimate currently. Farther east, the estimates aren't very accurate, but something like another 20, 30,000, I think, across the range. So probably the global population is around 60 to 70,000 individuals.
Hopefully, those inaccurate population measures in the east of the range are underestimates, because there's far less people in that Mongolian steppe than there is in the European habitat. So hopefully there's less people taking notice, and there might be more birds there. But like everywhere, they're running out of space, aren't they?
They're running out of space, and I think that in the east of the range, the conservation is maybe less developed. The conservation movement in Russia and Mongolia and China, for instance, in some places there's still some serious hunting of great bustards in some countries, while in Europe, of course, they're quite strictly protected. I think maybe regulations on agricultural development aren't very strict in some parts of Russia and Central Asia. So yeah, their future currently isn't very bright, but I hope that with international collaborative work, good progress can be made in the next decade or two.
The steppes of Europe and of that the Western Asia are quite unique habitats. They're not really modelled, or we don't really have well, nothing's identical, but a similar kind of habitat in Australia. We have grasslands and we have stony deserts, but we don't really have that in between country, which would be called a steppe. What are some of the other species that inhabit that ecosystem in Europe, and are they also suffering the same threats as the bustard?
Yeah, I'll start with at least my observation that in Western Europe, especially in Iberia, there aren't any true natural steppes anymore. It's all part of a agricultural system, rotational system, combination of meadows and grazing areas, pastures, and cereal production, hay production. So traditionally, these were rotational systems, 3-4 year rotations. Now, of course, with intensification, these rotational systems are broken, and you can see like monocultures over a few years. But I think that in Iberia, at least, I don't think there's any proper natural steppe. It's all what's called agro steppe, pastures and meadows and hay fields and stuff like that. But anyway, over thousands of years, many birds adapted to these systems. Some other representatives are little bustard, a couple of species of sandgrouse, pintail sandgrouse, black-bellied sandgrouse, and a few larks, calandra lark, short-toed lark, quail, roller, lesser kestrel. These are some of the typical species of these systems. Monitoring of other species in Iberia isn't very good. That's one of the recommendations from my research, to extend the monitoring from great bustards to other species too, because different species have different ecological requirements. At least little bustard is monitored properly in Iberia, and they're doing probably even worse than great bustards. So in the last 10 years, Spain has lost more than half of their little bustards. They're seriously threatened in Spain, and Portugal probably the same. So other agro-steppe species aren't doing very well in Iberia either. Some species that cope well with heavily grazed pastures, like calandra lark, short-toed lark, sandgrouse species, can probably survive in the changing conditions. But other species like the bustards aren't doing very well, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we've got a bustard in Australia, and I've never seen one. Been looking, but I've never seen one in the wild. To qualify that, I have seen one in a nature park. I've the Middle East and Israel, obviously, where you are based, are areas of the world that I think people who have not travelled there think of as stony, dry, dusty, almost treeless landscapes. Now, is that how it really is?
Some parts of the Middle East are quite arid, obviously. Israel is a very diverse and very interesting country in the heart of the Middle East. Very, very basically, you can divide Israel into two parts. The northern section of the country is Mediterranean climate, covered with Mediterranean scrub. It's an open scrubland of mainly oak and pistachio trees, bushes. So it is quite green, with some nice lush valleys and wetlands. The southern half of the country is indeed arid. It's a desert habitat, but also a very complex system of deserts. It's not a mono structure of desert. There's stony desert, there's sandy desert, there's semi-desert, big mountains and big cliffs and deep canyons, and nice, beautiful, sandy plains where ground breeding larks and sandgrouse and bustards breed. We have our own breeding bustard in Israel, the McQueen's bustard. It's globally endangered as well. So Israel is a very diverse country. We even have some tall mountains up in the northeast, Mount Hermon, with alpine habitats, snow covered in winter. So Israel is a very diverse country, and actually that's one of the most amazing things, I think, for visitors who come to Israel, that in one day you can drive across the country. So Israel is about 500 kilometers from top to bottom. So you can cross very, very extreme eco types or eco zones in few hours driving from the alpine habitats of Mount Hermon into the deep, harsh desert. And in 10 days or 2 weeks visiting Israel, you can bird these different habitats properly and get to know them and get to see the different species. So at least in a regional scale, Israel is a very, very diverse country from habitat perspective and also from a bird perspective.
So if someone spent a year in Israel and they were going to try and see every one of the species that you would expect to see, what kind of numbers would they be ticking off?
Okay, so it's quite a coincidence. I'm actually doing a big year, so I can tell you what's an extreme, what you can see in an extreme effort. But I would say in a normal year, if you properly birded the country, you could see about 300 to 350 species. It's not huge compared to tropical parts of the country, but in Israel, I think it's not too bad. And the big year I'm hoping to reach 400. Last year I did 389. So this year I'm pushing myself a bit harder, and hopefully I'll get to 400. But that's quite a serious effort.
And what are some of the sort of special species that an Israeli thinks about when they're going birding? What are you hoping to see? What are the really familiar favourites of everybody in Israel?
Yeah, so Israel is too small to have any proper endemic species. We don't have any endemic bird species. There's one near endemic. It's called Syrian Seren, breeds on Mount Hermon in Israel and adjacent sections of Lebanon and Syria. So that's the closest thing to endemic species we have. But there are some very localized species that are very difficult to see in other parts of the world. One of them is Nubian Niger, for instance. You can call them my babies. I did quite a lot of research on them, and I'm deeply involved in their conservation in Israel. They're special night birds living in the Rift Valley, southern part of the Rift Valley, south of the Dead Sea, in the lowest place on Earth. And there are quite a few species that when people come to Israel, international visitors, they're high on their lists, like McQueen's bustard, desert tawny owl, Arabian warbler, hooded wheatear, Hemming's lark, quite a few other desert species that are maybe not easy to see in other parts of the world, but in Israel, you can, if you know where to go, you can see them quite easily. And some common desert species like fan-tailed raven and Tristram starling, scrub warbler, street scrub warbler, Arabian babbler, they're all quite common in Israel, in the desert regions, but really not easy to see in other parts of the world.
And are there any of the uh, birds in Israel that are significantly threatened? I mean, I'm going to assume that McQueen's bustard is on that list, but are there any other birds that are high priority for Birds Israel?
Yeah, so we have, I think the latest count is 67 species that are on our red list. Yeah, Israel is a complicated country from a conservation point of view. It's one of the most crowded countries from a human population in the OECD, with the highest growth rate by far. So the pressure on the natural systems, the pressures are very high. And it's not, it's a big challenge for conservation organizations in Israel. But we're doing our best. We have made some serious progress, I think, in how the country is developing and running in the last few decades. But yes, the pressures are very high. We do look a lot at our breeding species because we understand the strong link between the breeding birds and their ecosystems, the habitats themselves. So the breeding birds are excellent indicators for the state of the different habitats or systems, ecosystems we have in Israel. But another thing that we need to remember about Israel is one of the globally most important migration bottlenecks. We lie on one of the main migration routes in the world, the East Mediterranean flyway, and Israel is the bottleneck of the bottleneck of the bottleneck. We're talking about something like 500 million birds that funnel through Israel twice a year. So it's quite a serious river of birds that floods Israel. In spring, they migrate north to the breeding grounds in Europe and Asia. In autumn, they fly back south to the wintering grounds in Africa. And it's quite intensive, this migration. This last few weeks have actually been quite exciting. We had an exceptional migration event during the first half of May, something that hasn't been seen here for about a decade. The numbers, the diversity were quite fantastic. A reminder of how important Israel is as a stopover site for huge populations that migrate through Israel between Eurasia and Africa.
Well, let's talk about that geography for a moment. because the bottleneck is caused by geography. So on one side, obviously, you have the Mediterranean. What are the geographical features uh, on the on the other side that are causing the bottleneck?
Yeah, so basically, birds try to avoid flying above water. Most of the birds, especially the large soaring birds, but not only them, also the small passerines that migrate at night, even they try to avoid flying over water. So they would bypass the Mediterranean. And on the other side, there's the Red Sea, and a bit further east, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf, Persian Gulf, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. All of these different water bodies funnel the migration more and more and more and more. And eventually in Israel, it becomes the tightest, the narrowest land bridge between Eurasia and Africa.
And you mentioned how important Israel is as a stopover site, as a refueling location, for want of a better scientific term. But the birds need to stop, they need to feed, they need to rest. So, what are some of the sites within Israel that need to be preserved because of this twice a year usage by the birds?
Yeah, so what we need to remember is that south of Israel, there's a huge desert belt of about 3,000 kilometers. So in spring, birds, when they arrive in Israel, it's after crossing a huge, very hostile desert habitat. And in Israel, the habitats in Israel are the first proper habitat that they've met for thousands and thousands of kilometers. And when the birds migrate south in the autumn, Israel is the last fueling spot before crossing this desert belt. So the stopover sites in Israel are extremely important. Eilat in the south of the country, the far south of the country, is literally the last green spot before the desert belt, and it's a globally important stopover site there. We have a very successful and beautiful bird observatory there. It's called the Hilat Birding Center. And they've been monitoring bird migration there for a few decades now. And they manage some very important habitats for these migrants, salt pans and reed beds and different types of vegetation. Water is the story there. Water is very scarce, obviously, in the desert. So wherever there's irrigation, it attracts birds, and it's quite fantastic down there. Further north of the country, the Hula Valley is another global hotspot for bird migration and as a stopover site. Very lush, beautiful valley with excellent habitats. The cranes there is a big success story, but lots of other birds as well. And there are a few important stopover sites along the Mediterranean coast. Magan Michael is an important place, but there are quite a few others. Along the central mountain range, the Jerusalem Bird Observatory manages another wonderful stopover site for migrants, for passerines. So there are quite a few important stopover sites across the country, basically where there's good vegetation, it attracts birds. But I think that's one of the most important things and the most unique experiences when foreign birders visit Israel. You have migration evident and present and sort of in your face everywhere in the country. You don't need to travel to special places to experience migration. Migration is everywhere and over every part of the country. Above my house in the center of the country, nowhere special. There's huge migration, and you really just need to look up or look in the bushes, look in the trees and the gardens, and you find birds. You don't need to travel to these special hotspots. Of course, in these hotspots, the numbers are greater and the diversity can be greater, but one can experience fantastic migration just anywhere in the country, and that's quite extraordinary, I think.
given the amount of birds that you've just mentioned are present, and those busy times of bird traffic, how how much are birds front of mind in the general community in Israel?
Birding is certainly picking up. Not only birding, obviously, conservation and appreciation of nature. It is developing in Israel. We are still, I would say, decades behind Europe or North America or Australia in that case, in how conservation and nature awareness are part of the culture. Maybe it's because Israel is a relatively young country with a young society, and we need a few more decades to develop this kind of appreciation of nature. But we're getting there. There is a positive movement in that direction. More and more people are involved in bird conservation, bird watching, bird monitoring, and we certainly see much and more engagement, especially in the last 10 or 20 years. So we are in the right direction. We still have a long way to go, obviously, but there's always a long way to go if you work in conservation.
Now, politically, it's a complicated part of the world, but because the countries are quite small and they share these species, are there successful cooperative conservation measures between countries or between NGOs that are located in the different countries that other sort of cooperation between the countries doesn't happen so easily? I mean, is it a unifier in some way?
Honestly, there's very little, to be honest. There's very, very little cross-border collaboration, much less than what we'd want to. Obviously, the political situation in the Middle East is very complex. Personally, I have very little faith in what governments will ever achieve in our region. If you look globally and regionally, the processes aren't very positive. We as an NGO, we have the freedom and the ability to do our best to reach across the borders and to do whatever we can. Rarely we find a receptive other side. Unfortunately, in most cases, the other side, when we try to reach across the border, will deny our contact. Some of them fear to be perceived as collaborators with Israel. Others technically can't. Others don't want. It's not easy. We do have few success stories. There's a very famous success story with a barn owl project. Barn owls are used as natural pest control agents in open cultivated areas. There's a big nest box scheme in Israel, and we've exported that to the Palestinian territories, to Palestine, and to Jordan as well. And we have collaboration with some small NGOs, conservation NGOs, and other civilian organizations in Jordan and in the Palestinian Authority. But these collaborative projects are very, very, very local, small scale, and I wish we do much more, but it's not easy. However, I must say that over the last few years, we are able to reach out to different countries that we have no diplomatic relations with through third parties, but it's sometimes really top secret, really to protect the people working in these projects, and we try to do small stuff on the ground. It's very difficult, very challenging, sometimes seriously dangerous, but we believe this is the only way from the bottom, from the ground, um, to sow the seeds of peace, of collaboration, of cross-border work. The governments won't do that, only the civilians, and we're doing our best. It's still quite local and small scale, but hopefully in the future we'll make some achievements in there.
Can we talk about the Barnell project? That sounds fascinating. What was the genesis of that project, and what was its scope?
Yeah, so it all started in the Bet Shean Valley, in the Rift Valley, I think about 40 years ago. The fields there are huge alfalfa fields there. They're used as cow fodder. Um, and they had for some decades a big problem with rodents destroying the crops there. And the farmers starting using excessive amounts of pesticides to kill the rodents. And it just reached a bit of a climax there, that there was so much pesticide use that it was just impossible to use the crops anymore. And the farmers there, together with the Tel Aviv University and with my organization, the Birdlife Israel, Society for Protection of Nature in Israel, started to develop an alternative pest control using barn owls and actually also kestrels as pest control agents. Basically, we increased the availability of breeding opportunities, breeding sites in sort of flat, featureless plains. And as a result, the density of these barn owls and kestrels increased significantly, and they apply enough pressure on the rodents, both day, the kestrels, and night, the barn owls. And basically in the Bet Shean Valley, pesticides aren't used anymore in those fields. So the farmers were able to reduce the pest pressure so much with the barn owls that they don't need to use these rodenticides anymore. And it's quite a big success story. And this success story was used as a bridge, as a way to reach across the border into adjacent parts of Jordan and the Palestinian territories, working in similar agricultural systems there with farmers and with conservation NGOs. And I think the success is as significant there in Jordan and in Palestine as well. And as I said, it's a way for us to sort of reach across the border and establish some kind of cross-border collaboration. Whatever kind of cross-border collaboration we can establish is a blessing, and we're trying to do whatever we can.
With BirdLife Israel, what are the other major projects that have either been completed or are underway now?
So another high-profile project we're involved in we're leading is Champions of the Flyway. I'm not sure whether you've heard about it in Australia, but at least in North America and in Europe, it's quite a famous project. The story is the huge scale of illegal killing of birds around the Mediterranean basin. Something like 30 to 40 million birds are killed illegally every year across the Mediterranean basin. And together with BirdLife Europe, we developed a conservation project called Champions of the Flyway to tackle illegal bird killing in different parts of the Mediterranean basin. So the idea is to establish a conservation project with a local BirdLife partner in one of those Mediterranean countries. So we worked with BirdLife Malta and BirdLife Cyprus and BirdLife Turkey and BirdLife Georgia. and BirdLife Greece. We work together with them in Croatia and Serbia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and different projects to tackle illegal bird killing. We raise funds for these countries. And some of these countries, the amounts we raise, maybe they're not huge, 80 or 100,000 US dollars. But for a small NGO in Georgia or in Kazakhstan, this could be a game changer for their efforts. So we raise awareness, we raise funds, and we bring people from around the world to Israel for a bird race, which is part of this awareness campaign and fundraising event. It takes place every year in the end of March in Eilat in Israel. And we've been doing it since 2014. It's a very successful story. I work in it together with my colleague, Jonathan Meirav. He's the coordinator and the leader of this project. And our director, Dan Alon, is also deeply involved in this. But it's a fantastic project. Champions of a Flyway, you can check it online. Next year, we're working on turtle doves. Turtle doves are a very, very dramatic story. Some call them the next passenger pigeon. They're declining dramatically across the range in Europe and Asia. And we're trying to do a collaborative project around the Mediterranean with different countries to stop their illegal killing. Also in Israel, we have this problem of hunting. We're trying to stop that as well. But the next year, we're raising money for turtle doves. We're calling the Year of the Dove.
The thing I think of when you mention illegal killing or illegal hunting, I usually think of raptors because people are protecting, or they think they're protecting, chickens or ducks or other poultry species. But why? What other? What are the species that are being killed, and what are the main reasons for that?
Yeah, so bird hunting, bird killing is a part of the Mediterranean tradition. So basically, all countries around the Mediterranean hunting, bird hunting is part of the tradition for hundreds of years or for thousands of years. People have gone out and hunted birds first for food, but over the years, it really has developed into a tradition, sport, recreation, and sadly, hunting and poaching is extremely common, too common around the Mediterranean and in Arab countries in the Middle East. Um, so as I said, something like 30, 40 million migratory birds are killed every year. The big species, or the species killed in big numbers, are blackcap, turtle dove, quail, song thrush. A few others are killed in big, big, big numbers. Robins, redstart, and some of these species, like turtle dove, are declining very, very fast. It's not only hunting, but hunting is a big, big component of their decline globally.
Come on, Mediterranean fellas, give it a rest. Give it a rest, mate. That's that. Um, I had no idea that the numbers were that significant, and certainly that the target species were so widespread. Um, so it's a completely different problem to that of the persecution of raptors, which is the one that tends to get most of the attention in
That's right.
media circles. Um, Yoav, Birdlife Israel, how big is it? How many of you are on staff, and what are the changes that you think you've been able to affect, apart from the specific projects? But um, I, you mentioned to me before we pushed the button to go to record that you'd spent some time in Australia, and I see that you've worked in or visited other many other parts of the world. how how much do you think you're sort of shifting those attitudes and making conservation in general um, a significant issue in the country?
Um, yeah, so first of all, we are a branch of a larger conservation NGO. It's called the Society for Protection of Nature. It's the largest conservation NGO in the country. And our branch, Birdlife Israel, we have a staff of about 10 people. It's not a huge organization, it's a small organization, but I think our leverage is quite significant in the way that we are, I think we're regarded as the expert bird people in Israel. So whenever anyone has a question about birds or they need information about birds, they know who to contact. We have two very successful observatories, bird observatories, the Jerusalem Bird Observatory and the Hilat Birding Center. Fantastic places to visit, and they do invaluable monitoring and research work, but also outreach and education and regional conservation work. So they're very, very important. And in addition, we have like national staff. My role in the organization, I'm the science director. So I coordinate all of the research monitoring work that we do around the country. And we work also in tourism. We do internal tourism, and we also receive international visitors. So we try to organize that as well. And we do education and outreach, advocacy. We're a small organization, but I think with quite high capacity and high leverage, at least that we want to think of ourselves. We work in social media, and we have a very successful website, birds.org.il, both in Hebrew and in English. So I think we're doing quite well. As I said, because we're part of a large conservation organization, I think we have very strong tools to affect national processes. With the SPNI, we are able to influence the national planning system and other national processes. We collaborate with many governmental organizations and other agencies to reach farther and to make better progress. The pressures are huge, and Israel is a complicated country. Sometimes the development of the country is very political. It's not sort of natural growth here. People are settled in places where maybe they shouldn't have been settled for political reasons, and we need to cope with that. And sometimes the agenda in the country is very difficult. Just last week, we had a mini war here in Israel, and during wartime, 2 weeks of war, there's no one to talk to, nobody to do any work with. The country sort of goes into a standstill in a way. So yeah, it's not easy to work here in the country, but we're doing our best, and I think that we have managed to make some serious progress in the last few decades in the way the national planning system is operating. Until 2-3 decades ago, if we tried to influence a planning process, people would look at us as weirdos. And today, in the national planning agenda, talking about biodiversity, talking about wildlife habitats, restoration, ecosystems, climate change, it's part of the national agenda. Not always we succeed, obviously, but I think we have made some significant progress, and I think we're doing quite well.
I have to keep reminding myself, Yoav, that there are wins out there that people are having, and that we need to keep reminding ourselves that sometimes we win, and sometimes the change is for good. So I'll always try and bear that in mind. Now, I want to take a step back because I forgot to ask you the question when you mentioned the bird race when we were talking about the flyway.
Yeah.
What do you race? Tell me about it.
So basically, it's a 24-hour race within a specific geographic region. And with COVID, of course, COVID put us on hold for a couple of years, but we're hoping that in 2022, March 2022, we'll have our international race. Every year we have something like 20 or 30 international teams, mainly from North America and from Western Europe, but we've had teams from China, India, and South Africa. Obviously, we have good friends coming from there, and other parts of the world. We have teams from Israel as well competing in the same race. So something like 30, 40 teams birding hard for 24 hours within a specific geographic range around Hilat, trying to document as many bird species as possible. I think the highest list was about 4 years ago. A South African team reached over 180 species in those 24 hours. It's pretty hard going, especially in the middle of the day. It does get quite hot already in late March, but it's a fantastic day. I don't know if you've ever taken part in a big day, birding nonstop for 24 hours. It's quite fantastic, including 2 night periods. It's quite intensive, but it's amazing fun.
No, I haven't, but I did keep an eye on the global big day, which happened a few weeks ago. I'm I'm just far less interested in lists, but I do like the idea of being involved in something like a birding marathon to raise money for a specific project or something.
Yeah, and that's a very important component of Champions of the Flyway. So the bird race itself is just a celebration, the climax of the whole effort. But we urge our teams, we promote their efforts to raise funds. So the teams raise the funds in their countries, they reach their audiences. That's why we try to reach different countries to extend our audience. First of all, the awareness, but also the funds. They're really critical for bird conservation. In the first year, we worked with the partners in Georgia. In Georgia, in Batumi, there's a big problem with illegal killing, mainly of raptors. And the Sabuco, the BirdLife partner in Georgia, they use the funds raised by Champions of the Flyway to successfully tackle the problem there. And they've saved the lives of tens of thousands of mainly birds of prey every year. So birds like honey buzzard and harriers and black kites and eagles were shot there in tens of thousands every year in this migration bottleneck. And using the funds from Champions of a Flyway, Sabuco managed to bring this problem to an end. They dramatically reduced the number of birds shot there illegally every year. And that's only one success story. And we're very proud of these stories, but it's really conservation. So we're working for conservation. The bird race at the end is the celebration, the party, and it's great fun, but it's really all about conservation.
And a great way for people to meet each other
Exactly.
who may have only connected via emails or social chat. So, yeah, great way to reach out.
And maybe in the next years we'll have a team from Australia. Who knows? I know that there's a lot of excellent work being done in Australia, conservation and birding. Maybe one day, BirdLife Australia team or Bird Emergency team, Champions of a Flyway. Maybe one day.
I'd love to get a bird emergency team together and travel around, do a big year doing birding competitions and speaking to schools and community groups and stuff. Wouldn't that be great? But doing episodes from not only different projects but different locations, that would be
That's right.
fantastic.
That's right.
I should probably interject there. I'll be speaking to someone from Raptor Aid soon to speak about the specific plight, the it just seems mindless, the killing of any sort of raptor in so many countries. And we've also got a Philippines eagle show coming up very soon. So, yeah, and maybe vultures too.
Yeah, yeah.
I've had a lot of trouble getting hold of someone to talk to me about vultures, but that
Well,
seems to be a massive.
yeah, let's talk after this show. I can help you establish
Well,
some
you can
connection.
hook me up,
Yeah,
man. That's
I
great.
will. I will.
That's great. Uh, you you mentioned that you feel like the organisation Birdlife Israel and the greater society has been making good inroads. It, is conservation a topic that comes up in everyday conversation, like the old dinner party, or as we say in Australia, the barbecue stopper? Are people in general concerned about the natural environment, or because, as you alluded to, the political situation in Israel, not only the conflict, but also the way Israel was formed, and you mentioned the way it has been settled and the complex political, domestic political situation that has existed. Does does that mean that conservation is still not a sort of top 10 issue for most people?
Um, I would say it is. Maybe it's in the top 10, but not in the top five. I'm afraid. Um, yeah, as you said, the political situation here is complex and unstable. We're following the steps to our fifth elections in 2 years. So obviously the elections and the security and the other internal processes are always in the top of the agenda. But yes, I would say climate change is becoming more and more part of the daily conversation, and especially in urban areas. I think more and more people do appreciate wildlife, urban wildlife, and they see the effects of climate change. And there's, of course, better education in some parts of the country. So yes, so I think we are making progress in there. People are talking. However, I can see when we're approaching elections and different parties are displaying their agenda, conservation, wildlife, climate change isn't in the top five, but it is getting into the top 10, I would say, of the topics that they talk about. Hopefully, in a few decades, the country will be a bit more stable politically, and there will be more room for other civilian topics to develop, to talk about, like conservation, climate change, and wildlife.
Let's talk about you. Let's talk about
Okay.
you and your work
Okay.
a bit more specifically. Um, Now, you've told us about your your doctorate, your work for your thesis, but what were you doing leading up to that? And what was your focus when you started your academic studies? Were you were you big into birds at that time?
Yeah, I started birding as a kid, and I was always have has been sorry I always have been a very keen birder. I'm one would say I would one of the keenest birders in the country. I go birding every day. Um, I try to see as many birds as I can. And since young age, I was always involved in bird monitoring, bird surveys, bird studies. And when I started my academic studies, I tried to develop that, and I was always focusing on these kind of topics, bird research, bird monitoring, and that led to my positions. First of all, I worked in a few bird observatories and bird monitoring projects, and I started as a worker there, and then I started coordinating and directing programs, and eventually it led up to my current position as the science director of my organization. But yeah, birding is a very major component of my life and of my work as well. So even though my title is a director, I choose to do as much field work as I can myself. So I could use freelance birders or ornithologists or technicians, but I try to do as much as I can personally because I love it so much, because it's important for my soul, and because I think I'm good at it. So I combine my work with birding, and I feel quite fortunate I'm able to do that. And another component of my work, I lead tours for rock jumper birding tours, and that takes me birding around the world, and I have the joy of birding in beautiful places in the world and showing the wonders of these beautiful places to other birders. So I'm fortunate in that way too. Yeah.
So tell us where the travels have taken you on your both your tour guiding pursuits, but just your personal travels birding.
Um, yeah. So after I finished my military service in the in '98, basically I finished my military service. In Israel, there's compulsory service, and many people after doing their military service, they take sort of time out and travel around the world a bit. So I did that a bit extreme. So I stayed in Israel in the military for 5 years. I did the 5 year service, and then I traveled in Asia for about a year and a half, birding, just non-stop birding on my own, day after day, for about a year and a half, and then I ended up in Australia. That's how I lived in Australia. I met a wonderful Australian woman while traveling in China, and we ended up together, and I moved in together with her in Melbourne. We lived together for about a year. I found some work actually in Birds Australia during the time I worked there. There was a bird atlas project in those years, 99 and 2000. So I actually did some work for the bird atlas project back then. Yeah, so that was a fantastic time to travel around the world because it was really hardcore exploration. It was pre-internet. There were hardly any bird books for Asia back then. And I really explored some uncharted parts of the continent and in Asia, in Tibet, in China, Mongolia, Far Eastern Russia, Laos. It was really wonderful. What I did in almost every country I reached. From the airport, I took the first bus or train to the local bird organization. I knocked on their door and asked them, do you need help in bird surveys or bird research that they do? And many of them said yes. And that way I managed to volunteer in India, in Nepal, in Thailand, in Mongolia. And then I worked in Australia doing bird monitoring, bird surveys. It brought me to wonderful parts of the country. I got to meet wonderful people. And I even think I managed to contribute a bit to those countries. It was quite great.
I think that's the best way to do birding tourism. Just
Certainly.
go and get involved.
That's right.
What were you working on in Australia specifically? I mean, that was a massive project, the Bird Atlas project.
It
So,
was.
what were you specifically tasked with here?
Yeah, so I worked with the Atlas team there to manage the data. So back then it was still paper, and we received forms from the people taking part, and we computerized the data and did the data quality work and some basic data analysis. So I worked there during the project. So first steps of data analysis. And also I was very fortunate to join some expeditions to the heart of Australia, to some parts that they didn't receive enough data from birders living there. So I joined a few of these expeditions into the interior to collect data for the project, and it was great fun.
No doubt. You've probably seen more of Australia than most people. And birding in Laos, that must have been amazing.
It was. I must say that I more or less transited through Laos. I stayed there for just 2 weeks, so I didn't do much birding back then. I must say it was quite difficult to bird in Laos. There was no information whatsoever, and I was quite shocked by the bird hunting there. It was really massive everywhere, and I must say I didn't really enjoy birding in Laos. I transited through Laos into Thailand, and in Thailand, I, I I did enjoy the beautiful bird reserves there in the south and in the north. It was quite fun.
Did you do much in Indonesia?
No, I as an Israeli still I can't enter Indonesia with an
Of
Israeli
course.
passport, unfortunately. I have other passports now, so I can enter Indonesia, but I haven't been there yet. It's high on my bucket list. I'll get there in the near future, I hope.
Well, you've opened the door to the bucket list question. So
Yeah.
let's let's start with the field guide question.
Okay.
What and we'll have to do this in a few steps, I think, because you've been so many places. But in Israel, what is the field guide that you use and that you
Okay.
would recommend?
Okay. So the definitive field guide for Israel, Europe, and the Middle East is the Collins Bird Guide. It's a book and an app. I think today probably there are more app users than actual hard copies. But yeah, it's translated into Hebrew as well. I did much of the translation myself. Uh, so it's commonly used in Israel. It's certainly the bird to use when visiting Israel, Europe, and the Middle East, North Africa. That's the best source for sure.
Have you migrated over to using the app, or are you still taking your hard
Uh,
copy out?
no, I certainly use the app. The app is so rich in other media components like sounds and videos, and it's very useful. So I certainly use the app as much as I can. Um, yeah, I did. Well, I more or less stopped using uh, paper and pen doing field work quite some years ago. So I try to use technology when I do my birding as much as I can without interfering the birding, of course. It's always the binoculars first, but I try to make the best use of technology that's available there.
So are you taking a phone or are you taking an iPad
I
or
take
other tablet?
Nowadays I use a phone, obviously. Before the phones, I did use tablets, but yeah, today I do everything with my phone. In Israel, eBird is very, very, very big. People use eBird almost exclusively to record their birds and to manage their data. I'm the coordinator of eBird Israel, so I'm in charge of the data as well. And Israel is big in Israel, and it's becoming bigger and bigger. And in a way, actually, it's become quite a useful bird guide because it includes so many different other components just than recording the birds, like Merlin Bird ID and other media components. It's great to explore the different birds of the country using eBird. So that's, I think, the new age bird guide, even more than the classic bird guides like Collins or other bird guides.
When you were in Australia, which book, which field guide did you use?
Um, do you know something? I must admit I don't remember. It was in 99 and 2000. Maybe you can refresh my memory. What was the best bird book?
I'm thinking back
No.
then it would have been Slater or
Yeah,
Morecambe.
it was this
Slater.
later. It's later, yeah.
Let me.
No, of course, no bird apps there or electronic bird books back then. Yeah, 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 yeah. That
That
was
one?
that
Yeah.
one. Yeah.
So the Slater field guide.
Yeah,
That's
that's one regret I have, I must say. So I lived in Australia for almost a year, and there are very large sections of Australia that I haven't visited yet. So I didn't go up to the Northern Territory at all or to Western Australia. So these are, especially the Northern Territory, is high on my bucket list. Talking of
well,
bucket lists, so
well,
that's certainly one place I want to explore.
well. The good thing is there's still time. There's still
I know,
time.
I
So
know, I
we
know.
just have to knock this COVID on the head,
That's
and
right.
then
That's
and
right.
then get out amongst it.
Yeah.
So bucket list. What's your bucket list bird?
Bucket list bird. I think shoebill is one of them. Shoebill. I want to get to Uganda and to see shoebill. That's one serious bucket list bird. But you know, it's a funny question. I think, especially for people who are professionals in bird research and bird monitoring and bird conservation, I know that especially for myself, looking at birds that way, I do appreciate the commonest birds as well. Um, from the birds breeding in my backyard to the commonest migrants, I appreciate them hugely. Uh, those migrants, the commonest migrants who do those amazing migrations, the little chiffchaff and the little lesser white-throat, they're not beautiful, especially or most colorful, but they're fascinating birds. And I think I have bucket list birds, and some birds obviously are colorful or rare or special or things like that. But I think I'm a bit more even in how I look at different birds, and I appreciate the little brown jobs as well. Quite
That's
serious.
right. Well, that's right. We're all fans of the little brown bird here.
That's right.
So,
Yeah,
well, we've got our nice little family of little brown birds, the thornbills here,
I
and
know. I know. Yeah, and I've never seen a bird of paradise. No,
well,
not
well,
even one. So, and there are quite a few
well,
to
that's
see. Yeah,
that's you and most people in the world. So
yeah,
I don't think many people have seen a bird of paradise. So
yeah. But
uh,
that's a family I'd love to get to know better. Yeah,
and sadly, I think there might be some urgency about seeing those birds because they're copying it from all sides, climate change and
yeah. Yeah, and the same goes for Madagascar, the special birds of Madagascar, and even Antarctica. I think those are two places I haven't had a chance to visit yet, and there is urgency there to visit those places before they're lost completely. Certainly in Madagascar, there are some unique and special birds that I'd love to see quickly.
yeah, but remember, we're celebrating the wins. We're celebrating
Yeah,
the wins, Yoav.
that's
Um,
right. That's right.
so you've perhaps answered the question, but where's your bucket list location?
Um, Yeah, so first of all, I think I'm very fortunate working for Rock Jumper. It's a good way to fulfill those bucket list destinations. Um, yeah, so Papua New Guinea is high on my list. Uh, Talking of birds of paradise, that's one place I would love to go and visit. Um, some of them wonderful parts of South America I haven't had a chance to visit yet, Ecuador and Colombia, Argentina. Um, yeah, actually, I have a bit of a big cat bucket list as well.
I was going to say that you've got a big bucket.
Yeah, I have a big bucket with some big cats in there. I've done quite a few big cats already. I've been to fantastic places, to the places where one can see those big cats, like the Pantanal in Brazil for jaguars, and wonderful nature reserves in India for tigers and things like that. I still haven't seen a snow leopard. Terry Townshend, he was on the podcast
Yes,
a few ago. He's
yes.
a great friend, and he knows he still needs to take me to see his snow leopards up in the mountains of Tibet. Um, so that's on the cars, I think.
Well, that's great. I like that. A totally unprompted shout out to a former guest. Of course, Terry's in the
Yeah, and
birding.
Terry, yeah, he came to Champions of the Flyway a few years ago. He was on one of our teams, and he's a great friend. And I really appreciate the amazing work he does in China and in Eastern Asia. He's really a pioneer there, and amazing things he's doing there.
And of course, Terry's episode was birding in Beijing and focused on the great work he's done with school kids with the swifts and community work with the cuckoos, the migratory cuckoos. So, yeah, love that, Yoav. Thanks for that.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed speaking to Terry. We actually did a just a live cross stream with him on the big day, and he
yeah, fantastic.
spoke to us from a marsh just
That's wonderful, wonderful.
outside of Beijing. So yeah, actually, it reminds me I must release that. I haven't put that out in the stream yet.
It's great.
Uh, um, where where's your favourite place that you regularly go birding?
Um, yeah, so as I said, in Israel, I'm very fortunate to live in a country that I can experience migration wherever I go. I really don't need to travel far to see wonderful migration. Sometimes I do travel, to different corners of the country to see the extreme events, but really in my during my dog walk in the morning, from walking out from home, I can witness fantastic migration. During migration periods, I can go out to the garden, sit down with a cold beer, and watch in a day tens of thousands of raptors and storks and pelicans and cranes going right over my house. So I really appreciate that I don't need to travel far. One place that's really special for me is the Jerusalem Bird Observatory. I live about half an hour away from Jerusalem. I grew up in Jerusalem, but I did leave Jerusalem when I grew up. Um, my brother, he's a birder and an ornithologist as well, and he founded uh, the Jerusalem Bird Observatory in 1994, together with another close friend, Amir Balaban. And it's really a special place. It's a small wildlife sanctuary right in the center of the city, on the grounds of the parliament, between the parliament and the Supreme Court of the country. There's a small patch of wildlife habitat there, and it's an amazing magnet for birds. It's like a green island in an urban sea, and it attracts fantastic migrants. And it's really one of my favorite places, especially this spring. It was really mind-boggling there. The volume of migration there and the diversity were truly fascinating. Um, and this place, it's really a special place in the center of the city. You sit there in wild habitat, you see birds, you see bird research, bird monitoring, and all around you, you hear the hustle and bustle of the city, buses and cars and sirens and all that kind of stuff. And you're in the middle of like a sanctuary, a wildlife haven. It's really a special place. There's a special community there of volunteers operating the work there. And it's a fantastic place to visit for anyone coming to Israel. But I feel very fortunate to visit there. I work there. a bit. I do their 1 or 2 mornings. So they do daily bird ringing there. So I do 1 or 2 days a month there um, to keep fit with my ringing skills. So I really, really enjoy going there.
You mentioned that you appreciate the little brown jobs. When
Sure.
when you are just sitting out in the backyard having a beer, watching the migrants head out overhead, what are the little brown jobs, the little urban birds that hang around in your garden?
Yeah, so the common resident birds, Palestine sunbird is a favorite, white spectacled bulbul, graceful prinia, laughing dove. I have barn owls, barn owls, barn swallows breeding. They built a nest just above my front door. Red rum swallows breed on my neighbor's house. Next year they should breed on my house. I like red rum swallows because they're actually long distance migrants. The barn swallows are resident here. House sparrows, obviously, hooded crows, miners have become very, very prominent. They're an invasive species, but in just over 20 years, they've become one of the commonest birds in Israel. And, I've grown used to them. I don't think I like them especially, but I can't hate them. They're birds, but
They're,
they
they're pretty.
are they are they are a problem in Israel.
Yeah, we have the same issues here in
I
in
know
urban Australia, but they're fascinating if you actually watch their group dynamics. They are a
they are they
fascinating
are
bird.
they are they are fascinating, and they have amazing vocalizations. I guess you could say they're quite pretty. They're very aggressive. In Israel, there's study going on in them. It's still hard to detect what direct damage they're causing, but they've become so dominant in some parts. They're they're by far the commonest bird species, so it must come on the expense of other bird species. And we can see declines of some urban birds. We still aren't able to associate these declines with the increase in miners in the last 20 something years, but there's probably something going on there.
Yeah, I think we're a bit lucky here in that we've got the Rainbow Lorikeet, which is a pretty pugnacious little
I
fella
know,
too.
I
That
know.
uh, that is a competitor for hollows and whatnot with the miner. But um, yeah,
But it,
I grew up hating the Indian miner because it was an invasive species. But um, when when the other birds are gone, you have to you have to appreciate what you've
that's
got
right.
in your
That's right.
urban setting.
That's
Um,
right.
yeah, and once the
Uh,
habitats are altered so greatly, um, will the others ever come back? Is the other question.
yeah, but I hope at least there's some kind of equilibrium here, and um, at least in most of the country, those urban birds that I mentioned are still common enough, and they're doing okay. And yeah, and birds like the Palestine sunbird, I think we can be very proud of them. They're wonderful birds. The male are beautiful and very familiar birds, and I love them.
And uh, are the sunbirds there similar to a lot of the other sunbirds in Asia that they
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The
adapt
same,
easily and that they will nest in any opportunity they have in an urban setting under
exactly.
eaves and or washing lines and
Exactly. Yeah, they belong to the same family and they're very familiar birds. Very often they would hang their nests, so have these hanging nests on flower pots and balconies, and yeah, they're very common and very familiar urban birds and lovely.
terrific. Now the the only sort of bird emergency question I haven't asked you, Yoav, is um, what's your favourite piece of kit when you're out in the field? We've had some very interesting answers. Usually it's binoculars. I'm I'm wondering whether you take a scope with you when you're out doing your work.
Yeah, so there's been some temporal dynamics in answers to that question. My basic kit is binoculars. I must say I'm a Swarovski junkie. So I use the Swarovski kit. I always carry my binoculars with me everywhere. As I said before, one can bump into a fascinating bird or witness bird migration anytime, anywhere. So even when I pick up my kids from school, I have my binoculars at least on my shoulder, if not on my neck, and always in my bag when I have meetings. I always have my binoculars with me. I have a scope in my car all the time, ready for action. And when I bird, I try to carry it with me as much as I can. Especially because in recent years I tried to do as much video recording. I record videos using my phone and a phone adapter through the scope. So the scope gives me the opportunity to take these videos, and I try to do as much as I can. I certainly enjoy photographing birds. I carry a camera when I do field work and when I go birding. I used to have a big 500 millimeter lens, but I sold that because it just became too heavy to carry together with a scope and a heavy backpack and bins. It just became too much for me. I'm not a 24-year-old anymore. So now I have a slightly more humble lens, but it's still all right. And I enjoy photographing birds. And I appreciate the importance of bird photographs for conservation. Whenever we have a report coming out, the photographs are a really important component of the report. When we're doing advocacy work, conservation work, education, photographs are really important, and the photographs need to be good and impressive. And I'm happy and proud that I can contribute to reports and to presentations and to posters. So I enjoy photographing birds.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to coin a new nickname for you here, Yoav, but with all that kit, I think you're the decathlete of the of the bird life world.
Maybe I must say that in recent years, my phone has become a really important part of the kit. That's something that I don't know how common it is in Australia, but at least in North America, in Europe, and in Israel as well, the phone has become an essential part of the birding kit for bird identification, for bird recording. I use my phone a lot when I'm in the field. As I said, it's always binoculars first, and I try not to get the phone in the way with my actual birding. But the fact that I have my phone with me, I can use the media on the phone. I can use it for bird identification using Merlin Bird ID. I can sound record birds. I can take photographs and videos that are important for identification. So my phone has become a very important part of my birding kit.
Now, you mentioned an adapter. Nobody has told me about the adapter before for the lens adapter. So, tell me about that. I'd
Yeah, there are different.
be interested to get one.
Yeah, there are different adapters that connect your phone to a scope that you can operate the phone without moving it all the time. And it's a wonderful way to take videos, to shoot videos, and to take photographs. So again, using the stability of the scope on a tripod. Yeah, I use a specific Swarovski phone adapter for my Swarovski scope, but there are other generic adapters. There are many different options, and they're all very good.
Okay, so if someone's looking for them, you look for the specific adapter for your scope rather than one for your phone.
But some are very generic with
Yeah, yeah,
different options for different scopes and different
yeah.
phones. There are other adapters too. You can connect DSLR cameras to telescopes. You can connect your phone to your binoculars, and there are many different adapters now that Mobile phones have, some of them have excellent cameras. It's certainly a tool to use.
That's a new one for the show. Nobody has
Right,
mentioned that. I was
right.
surprised when someone said gators, but no, that one, tick. I'm up with that. Now,
Okay.
the sort of the last thing I think we've covered it, covered off. But you're a lister, but you're not a fan. And you look. Let me get the phrasing right. You're a fanatical birder, but you're not a fanatical lister.
Um, it depends. In Israel, I keep a good list. I'm one of the top listers in Israel. I must say that the 4 years that I lived in the UK were quite disastrous. I missed quite a few good birds. But in Israel, yeah, I would say, as I'm a top lister and I've been doing it for many years, I do try to see each and every bird that comes to Israel. In Israel, it's easy because Israel is so small. And it's not like in Australia that when a new bird, you live in Melbourne, a new bird shows up in one of those remote islands in the north. It's quite a pain in the bum to get to one of those islands to tick the bird. In Israel, I live in the center of the country. In the worst case scenario, it's 3 hours by car to the farthest corner of the country. So I can get to that corner and back in a day. And I have a very flexible job. And thank God my wife is very receptive of my crazy stuff, my wonderful wife. So I have the ability to twitch every bird, but I must say that I enjoy finding rare birds myself, and I do keep my list. I do keep a global list, but I'm not a global lister. I mean, I enjoy seeing new birds. I enjoy going to new places and seeing new birds, but I wouldn't travel to a different place just for a specific species, for one species or another species. I have some friends who are big Western Palearctic listers and they invest their time in that. I'd rather go to a wonderful place with a huge bird diversity and wonderful habitats rather than to a distant corner of the Western Palearctic for two or three new species. It's not my cup of tea, but I appreciate lists. I do lists every day. I keep a year list. I do so as I said earlier, I'm doing a big year. So I'm trying to see as many bird species in Israel in 2021. So I appreciate lists, but I'm not a global lister. Um, Not yet,
Now,
at least.
I have to go here. You mentioned that you're one of the top listers in Israel. Who's your arch enemy? Who's your nemesis?
Yeah, so the birding, first of all, the birding community in Israel is so small, and we're all very good friends. So there are no enemies and no true enemies and nemesis. There are two guys ahead of me. Rami Mizrahi, he was actually my mentor, my trainer when I was a kid. He's from Jerusalem as well, and I learned birding and bird ringing with Rami. So he's a few species ahead of me. Barak, he's my age and is a very close friend, and we birded as kids together. So he's also a few species ahead of me as well. So currently I'm number three. Um, Before leaving to the UK, we were sort of tied together. And now these two guys, they have a few species advantage on me, but it's all right.
So, do
At
you
least I'm
share?
at least I'm younger than Rami, so I probably have a few more years to live more than him. So maybe I'll be able to catch up.
Do you share your list publicly? Like,
Yes,
do
yes, sure.
you get an alert on your phone and you go, Barack? Oh!
Of course, but yeah, but now I mean when we have one or two new bird species every year, and instantly we're there. Just about 2 weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, we had our first African white-backed vulture. So that's one of these cases that it's a drop everything and run moment. I tell my wife, "Sorry, babe, I need to go." I tell my boss, "Sorry, I have to cancel this meeting," and I just jump in the car and drive. But that's the privilege of living in tiny Israel.
I can just see you having a nap on the uh, on your seat with the sunbird weaving its nest, and you're having a nap in the sun. And beep beep beep. You pick up your phone. Rare bird alert.
That,
White-backed vulture.
that's how
Honey,
it goes.
honey, I'll see you tomorrow. I'm off to find a vulture.
That's how it goes. That's how it goes. Yeah, and as I said, I'm lucky that my wife is receptive of that. I don't think she enjoys that, but she's receptive, and she's still my wife. So hey,
Terrific. Well, that's great, Yoav. And look, you've done so much great work.
thank you.
It well, it's a really great body of work that you have done. Just translating the Collins Guide, that's pretty amazing. But yeah, look, I thank you for your efforts, and I hope that in the next decade or so that conservation becomes a real front of mind issue, not only in Israel but in the complicated Middle East, and that the flyway is forever protected.
Thank you, and yeah, I really appreciate first of all the invitation to join this podcast, and I truly feel that with everyone's access to technology nowadays, the world is much smaller, and it's easier to reach out to people, birders, and other parts of the world. I try to be as international as I can from small Israel, and I think I'm doing all right. And I'm in touch with many people in Europe and North America. We have a lot of collaborative projects and a lot of friends from all over the world. And I really hope that, yeah, so Northern Territories, maybe in a few years' time.
Uh,
And yeah, I'm looking forward to end this COVID thing.
well, one thing I always say on the show, Yoav, is that you can't do everything, but just go out and do something in the effort to spread the word and
Yeah,
save birds. The birding community is very well connected, as you're a good example of that, especially with the reference to Terry Townsend. Um, but it's really important, I think, that we just keep pushing the word out and trying to get everyday people more concerned about birds. I called the show the Bird Emergency because I just noticed that there were just less birds around. I
that's
was
right.
still seeing birds, but I was seeing less variety, and of certain types that I was very familiar with, I was just seeing less of them. So I assumed it was a global phenomenon, and I think I was right.
Yeah.
Yoav, where can people chase up more about you if they want to look up everything you've been doing? There's obviously Birdlife Israel.
That's
Um,
right. So our website is birds.org.il. But if you look up my name, I have quite a strong reach on multiple social media channels, um, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I have my own website, yoavperlman.com. So just Google my name, and it's quite easy to find what I'm up to.
I'll make it even easier. I'll put
Thank
links.
you.
I'll put
Thank
links
you.
in the show notes. It's been great meeting you, Yoav. I hope we
Same here.
speak again soon, and I hope I can get out there and take part in the bird race and
Yeah, that would be great.
and get some tips from the birding decathlete. I'm Grant Williams. This has been the Bird Emergency. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.